What's up, everybody? It's Vincent Visual bringing you another video. So I'm gonna make this video short, sweet, straight to the point. I know you got people to see, things to do, food to eat, etc. So we're gonna talk about shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. What are they and what do they do? So let's first talk about shutter speed. What is it and what does it do? I first want to say any setting except for ISO.
Any setting except for ISO.
Meaning shutter speed and aperture. If you crank up any of those settings, your image will allow less light, meaning your image will be darker. Meaning if you crank up one option, you got to compensate with the other, right? So if I have a high shutter speed and the image is dark on my camera, I'm going to have to compensate with either lowering my aperture or cranking up the ISO. Your ISO should always be the last resort only because it introduces grain to your photo, right? You don't want a grainy photo, right? So, shutter speed. If you're at a basketball game and you want to capture a still frame of, let's say, someone going in for a layup or a dunk, and you want to make sure you get that crisp image, right? You want to ideally have a high shutter speed, meaning 1/500th of a second or more. Again, let's say, for example, you have it at 1/500th of a second and your image is dark. Do one of two things. You can either A, crank down the aperture, or B, crank up your ISO. So that's shutter speed, how fast or slow your image is moving. The higher, the darker, the lower, the brighter, right? Now we're going to talk about aperture. Aperture is how blurry, how in focus your subject is, right? So you ever seen those portraits where it looks really blurry in the background? Yeah, that's because they have a very low aperture. This lens, this is a 50mm 1.4. So those extreme blurry backgrounds, I can achieve that with this lens, right? Now, let's say, for example, basketball example again. I want to capture someone going in for a layup and I want it to be extremely blurry, right? I'm close, and I want to get that extremely blurry shot. And I have to have a high shutter speed and a low aperture, and it's still not enough. Let's say it still looks dark, right? Still looks dark. That is when ISO is introduced, right? ISO, again, is your last resort. So going back to aperture. Aperture is how blurry your subject, the background, will be, right? So if I have an aperture right now of 1.4, this is going to be in focus. Everything else behind me is going to be blurry. Now, if I have an aperture of, let's say, f/16, you're going to see everything. All the details, you're going to see everything. However, it's going to make the image darker. So remember, the lower any setting is on your camera, except for ISO, the brighter is going to be. The higher the setting, the darker is going to be. Now, ISO, think of ISO as just extra brightness, just in case. Let's say you need some extra exposure, just crank up the ISO a little bit. There's no harm in doing it, but have you ever seen those images at night where people crank up the ISO to about, I don't know, 6400 or and higher, and it's incredibly grainy? It's bright, but it's really grainy. That's because that's what ISO does. It will introduce grain to your image. That's why I'm saying to be very careful with ISO. Again, little recap. Remember, shutter speed, how fast or slow something is moving. If you want to capture something in motion that's moving really, really fast, you need to have a high shutter speed, right? If you want to capture something that is, let's say a portrait, right? Like me standing still, you don't need a high shutter speed for that. You can use a shutter speed of about 1/125th of a second and above, depending on your personal preference. That way you can, have your other settings dialed in. What I usually do for my portraits, I have it at around 1/160th of a second, 1/125th. I don't need to have a higher shutter for something that's not constantly moving. If I'm at a baseball game and I want to capture, the dude swinging the bat, right? And I want to make sure I get it exactly when he's, at this angle right here, you have to have a high shutter. But again, having any high setting on your camera, again, for the third time,
High settings will introduce less light to your photos.
So you have to compensate. If one setting makes your image dark, that's fine. Bring down another setting or bring up your ISO. So that was aperture, shutter speed, and ISO in 7 minutes or less. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys really, I hope you guys put together what I was saying. I try to do everything quick, Like I said, I know you got people to see, things to do, food to eat, so try to make this video short. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give me a subscribe, please. That helps out a lot. I'm not gonna lie, won't hurt you, won't hurt me. If you dislike the video, make sure you press it twice just in case. But yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next video, and yeah,